The subway car rattled through the city, its fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow on the late-night passengers. Among them was a young woman, her headphones in, scrolling through her phone, unaware of the attention she was drawing. Across the car, a man watched her intently, his body language shifting from curious to unsettling. Other passengers looked away, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to notice. It was the kind of tension that often went unspoken in the city, a silent agreement to mind your own business. But not everyone in that car was willing to stay silent. Leaning casually against the door, an off-duty Marine, dressed in civilian clothes, had been keeping an eye on the man. His training had taught him to read people, to spot danger before it escalated. Something about the man's movements raised alarms. When the man suddenly moved closer to the young woman, crossing the unspoken boundary of personal space, the Marine straightened, his gaze sharpening. What happened next would shake the quiet stillness of the subway and test the limits of courage and instinct. Stay tuned to see how this tense moment unfolded, as one man stepped forward when no one else dared. The subway car swayed, the hum of the tracks punctuated by the occasional screech of metal on metal. The man had moved closer to the young woman now, close enough that she felt his presence. She glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly, but she said nothing and returned her focus to her phone. Maybe it was her way of dismissing the situation, hoping he'd take the hint and back off. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned in closer, speaking low, just enough for her to hear but not enough for anyone else to catch the words. Whatever he said made her stiffen. Her body tensed, a clear signal that something was wrong. Across the car, the Marine watched it all unfold. He noticed the subtle shifts in body language, the way the woman's shoulders drew up, her grip tightening around her phone, her eyes darting toward the exit as if calculating the distance to safety. He also noticed how the man loomed over her, his posture casual on the surface but predatory in its intent. The Marine had seen this kind of behavior before, both overseas and back home. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a situation teetering on the edge of danger. As the subway approached the next station, the Marine weighed his options. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he also couldn't shake the gut feeling that something bad was about to happen. He scanned the car, looking for allies, someone else who might be paying attention, someone who might back him up if things escalated. Most passengers had their heads down, eyes glued to their phones or fixed on the floor. A middle-aged man in a business suit seemed to notice the interaction but quickly looked away, pretending not to see. A couple sitting a few seats away exchanged nervous glances but made no move to intervene. The train came to a halt, and the doors hissed open. A handful of passengers shuffled off, replaced by a few others. The man made no move to leave, and the young woman didn't either, though her eyes flickered toward the open doors for a split second, as if considering an escape. The Marine took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the scene. He still didn't want to act prematurely, but his instincts were screaming at him to stay close. The train lurched forward again, and the man finally made his move. He reached out, grabbing the young woman's wrist. Her gasp was audible, sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the subway car. She yanked her arm back, but his grip was firm. "Hey," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "Let go of me." The Marine was already moving. His voice, calm but commanding, cut through the tension like a blade. "Let her go." The man turned, startled, his grip loosening just enough for the woman to pull free. He sized up the Marine, his eyes narrowing. "This doesn't concern you," he said, his tone low and threatening. "It does now," the Marine replied, his stance firm, his gaze unwavering. The man took a step back, but his posture suggested he wasn't about to back down completely. The Marine could see the gears turning in his head, weighing the risk of confrontation against his own intentions. Meanwhile, the young woman had moved to the other side of the car, putting as much distance as she could between herself and her aggressor. A few passengers looked up now, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, but no one else spoke. The tension in the air was palpable, like a storm about to break. The Marine's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had been trained for moments like this, though they usually didn't happen in the middle of a subway car. Still, training didn't erase the uncertainty. He didn't know if the man was armed, if he was alone, or if this was about to spiral into something far worse. The man squared his shoulders, trying to regain the upper hand. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he sneered. "You don't know who you're messing with." "Maybe not," the Marine said, his voice steady, "but I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to stand here and let you harass someone who clearly doesn't want anything to do with you." For a moment, it felt like time stood still. The man's eyes darted around the car, looking for an escape, for some way to assert his dominance without losing face. The Marine stood his ground, ready for whatever came next. In the midst of the standoff, the subway pulled into another station. The doors slid open, and a few more passengers got on, their conversations dying as they noticed the tension in the air. The young woman looked toward the open doors, her face a mix of fear and determination. The Marine caught her eye and gave her a slight nod, as if to say, "It's okay. You're safe now." But was she? The man didn't make a move to leave. If anything, he seemed emboldened by the fresh audience. "You think you're tough?" he said, stepping closer to the Marine. "Let's see how tough you really are." The Marine didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or his fists. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his calm demeanor more intimidating than any threat could be. The tension was unbearable, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. Everyone in the car was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, just as the doors began to close, the man turned on his heel and stepped out, disappearing into the crowd on the platform. The young woman let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping in relief. The Marine watched the man go, his eyes lingering on the platform until the subway pulled away. The car was silent for a moment, the passengers still processing what had just happened. The young woman looked at the Marine, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. The Marine nodded, his expression unreadable. He wanted to say something reassuring, something that would ease her fear, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply returned to his spot by the door, his presence a quiet reminder that sometimes, one person's courage is enough to change the outcome of a dangerous situation. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. The man had disappeared into the crowd, but his part in this wasn't finished. And the Marine couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't seen the last of him. The subway ride continued, the rhythm of the wheels against the tracks filling the silence left in the aftermath of the confrontation. The young woman remained seated on the far side of the car, glancing occasionally toward the Marine with a mixture of gratitude and lingering unease. Her hands still trembled slightly as she gripped her phone, but she was visibly calmer now. The Marine gave her a reassuring nod, a subtle acknowledgement that she was safe, at least for the moment. The other passengers, who had witnessed the tense exchange, began to relax as well. Some murmured quietly among themselves, while others returned to their phones, eager to distract themselves from the lingering tension. The Marine, however, remained alert. His gaze drifted toward the subway doors each time they opened, scanning the faces of those entering and exiting. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man might return or that this encounter wasn't entirely over. When the train finally reached the woman's stop, she hesitated before standing. Her movements were cautious, as if she expected the man to reappear at any moment. The Marine stepped closer, careful to keep a respectful distance. "Do you need someone to walk you out?" he asked, his voice low but steady. She hesitated, clearly conflicted. On one hand, she didn't want to impose, on the other, the thought of navigating the station alone felt daunting. Finally, she nodded. "If you don't mind," she said, her voice soft. The Marine offered a faint smile. "Not at all." As the doors opened, the two stepped onto the platform together. The air felt cooler here, the faint smell of concrete and machinery mingling with the distant hum of the city above. The platform wasn't crowded, but there were enough people to provide a sense of security. Still, the Marine remained vigilant, his eyes darting toward every shadowed corner and lingering figure. They made their way toward the exit, the fluorescent lights overhead casting long, pale reflections on the tiled walls. The woman spoke up as they walked, her voice tinged with both relief and lingering anxiety. "Thank you again. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." "You don't need to thank me," the Marine replied. "I just did what anyone should do." She offered a faint, rueful smile. "Not everyone would." The conversation lapsed into silence as they climbed the stairs to the street level. The cool night air greeted them, carrying the distant sounds of honking cars and murmured voices. The city felt vast and alive, a stark contrast to the enclosed tension of the subway car. The Marine turned to her. "Do you feel okay getting home from here?" She nodded. "Yeah, I'm just a couple of blocks away." She hesitated, then added, "But would you mind walking with me? Just in case?" "Of course," he said without hesitation. As they walked, the woman began to open up. She told him her name and a little about herself, how she had moved to the city for work, how she loved the energy of the place but sometimes felt overwhelmed by its darker sides. The Marine shared a bit about himself too, though he kept the details sparse. He mentioned his time in the service and his habit of staying observant, even when he wasn't on duty. It was this instinct, he explained, that had drawn his attention to the situation on the subway. They reached her building, an older but well-kept apartment complex tucked into a quiet side street. She paused at the entrance, turning to face him. "I really don't know how to thank you," she said. "You didn't have to get involved, but you did. That means a lot." The Marine shrugged lightly. "I just did what felt right. I'm glad you're okay." She hesitated, then extended a hand. "Thank you, really." He shook her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Take care of yourself. And if anything like this ever happens again, don't hesitate to speak up. There's always someone willing to help, you just have to let them know." She nodded, his words sinking in. With one last grateful smile, she disappeared into the building, leaving the Marine standing alone on the quiet street. He lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping the shadows once more before he turned and walked away. For a while, the Marine couldn't stop thinking about the man on the subway. Something about the way he had acted didn't sit right. It wasn't just the aggression, it was the calculated nature of it, the way he had seemed so comfortable intimidating someone in a public space. The Marine found himself wondering if this had been an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. His curiosity got the better of him. Over the next few days, he began keeping an eye on the local news and community forums, looking for any mention of similar incidents. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. There were scattered reports of a man matching the description harassing women on public transit, his behavior escalating each time. The accounts were eerily similar to what the Marine had witnessed, a man targeting women traveling alone, using intimidation and aggression to assert control. The Marine knew he couldn't let it go. He reached out to a friend who worked in law enforcement, sharing what he had seen and the details he had pieced together. His friend listened carefully, taking notes and promising to investigate further. "You did the right thing by stepping in," his friend said. "We'll do everything we can to find this guy." Days turned into weeks, and the Marine stayed in touch with his friend, providing updates whenever he came across new information. He also made a point of riding the subway more frequently, keeping an eye out for the man or any other suspicious behavior. It wasn't about playing hero, it was about doing his part to make the city a little safer. One evening, as he boarded a train, he spotted a familiar face. The young woman from that night on the subway was seated near the window, a small smile crossing her lips when she saw him. She waved him over, and he took the seat across from her. "Hey," she said. "Funny running into you again." "Small world," he replied, his tone light but warm. They chatted for a while, catching up on the weeks that had passed. She mentioned how she had started taking self-defense classes, inspired by the incident, and how it had given her a newfound sense of confidence. The Marine felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for her. She had taken a frightening experience and turned it into a catalyst for growth. As the train rattled on, the Marine couldn't help but reflect on the chain of events. One moment of courage had led to a ripple effect, touching not only the young woman's life but potentially many others. It was a reminder of the power of action, even in the face of uncertainty. The train came to a stop, and the young woman gathered her things, preparing to disembark. She paused before leaving, looking back at the Marine. "Thanks again," she said. "For everything." He nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Take care." As the doors closed behind her, the Marine leaned back in his seat, the city lights flickering past the window. The fight wasn't over, not entirely. But for now, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had made a difference. Sometimes, that was enough.